Okay, welcome everyone to today's community conversation. I am Lisa and I recently started as an officer in the Anticipation Hub. Our partnerships manager, Jessie, is on maternity leave, so I will take over the community conversations until a new colleague joins us. And if you would like to get in touch, I will post the partnership context in the chat. Also, before we begin, please note that this meeting will be recorded. So if you do not wish to be seen, please turn off your camera. And one last thing before I hand over to Clemens, you can now apply for the parallel sessions for the Global Dialogue platform. I will publish a link and an overview of all upcoming dialogue platforms in the chat as well. So now enjoy the meeting, and now to Clemens.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to this community conversation on rigorous impact evaluation of anticipatory action. So today's conversation happens in a series of community conversations where we want to people from sort of across the range of the anticipation community, as well as perhaps those that haven't had as much interaction with anticipatory action, together to shine the light on interesting topics that move the community sort of across board. And today's conversation is brought to you by the Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Practitioners Group, which you can find if you go to the Anticipation Hub and there on Exchange and working groups. And I will post the link in the chat here so that you have access to it as well. So this group is anyone who has a sustained interest and engagement in anticipatory action evidence generation. What does that mean? If you're like on a one-off project or you're in this for 3 months, etc., and then there are plenty of resources out there for you. But in this group, we want to bring together practitioners who want to sort of continue and build on a continuously growing conversation to see where can we move in terms of evidence generation, learning, and use of that evidence, obviously. So as we're hosting this conversation today, I will introduce our guests, our main act and course and speakers, so to say, in just a second. I just wanted to situate this conversation very briefly in terms of why do we talk about evidence generation and anticipatory action, what's moving us here, why is that important, and what's already out there. So why do we talk about this? We want to move from the essentially bean counting that many of us are used to be doing, so monitoring what was done, to understanding, is it actually working? And why is it working? And what about an intervention is working? And to answer this question, a key part is that issue of causal attribution, which you will have heard about. So determining whether there is a causal link between a specific intervention, such as anticipatory action, and an outcome that we observe. So did the intervention produce the change we observe or we want to see in our program participants? Why do we care about this as humanitarians, as anticipatory action practitioners? Because we need that evidence to design and deploy the most effective actions and to invest the scarce resources, which we have, into interventions that really promise to maximize impact, especially given the fact that we're acting under uncertainty. So we're acting based on forecast. And if that which sort of was forecasted to come to pass didn't happen, we want to make sure that the resources we invest really only go to those actions that are the most impactful. So what kind of evidence do we already have, and where does this piece that we will learn more about today fit in? There have been 2 reviews that broadly looked at the evidence base on anticipatory action to date, one from 2020 and one from 2022, a more recent one. I will post the link into the chat. So the 2020 review piece by WFP called the Evidence Base of Anticipatory Action is being updated as we speak. And so that's complemented by a 2022 sort of more recent look at what the evidence on anticipatory action says and where we're moving. Overall, I think there is a trend to say there is considerable momentum in evidence generation. So we moved from the bean counting part, or purely beneficiary satisfaction surveys as they are called, and they may or may not yield useful results or insights, to more quasi-experimental studies. So already sort of one step ahead in terms of now looking at the experience of those who benefited from anticipatory action versus those who didn't. And so what would have happened without anticipatory action, going in that direction, but those not being randomized studies. To now, the latest suite of fully randomized controlled trials that have either been completed or ongoing. So for example, last year, IFPRI and IRC published a piece on an RCT in Nigeria on anticipatory action. WFP, just this year, this June, completed an RCT on the effect of anticipatory action in Nepal. A research group at Oxford, together with Give Directly, is researching into doing an RCT on anticipatory action in Nepal. So you're seeing there is a wide range of evidence being generated, and there's really an enormous momentum going into evidence generation. And where that should all sort of feed into is hopefully the evidence base that we have on the Anticipation Hub. So you could go there and look for the various pieces of research that have been done. You could filter by, say, hazard or the type of action that you're interested, whether it's cash, what everyone is doing these days, or in-kind transfers, etc., and see what is the evidence that's already out there. Granted, this evidence base isn't always the most up-to-date, but at least once a year, the Anticipation Hub does make an effort to feed new pieces like the one we will learn about today into this. So do check it out. So which brings me to today's conversation. So what does it take to conduct rigorous impact evaluation of anticipatory action? We're super excited to have three researchers and colleagues here, friends of the anticipation community, so to say, that have an experience to share from an extremely rigorous assessment of anticipatory action in Mongolia, again with its own intricacies and sort of idiosyncrasies, as is presented by the case in Mongolia and their starting point. And not only will we hear about that experience, but also reflections from them about the current state of play on anticipatory action evidence, as well as their insights as what did we learn about the effectiveness of AA in Mongolia, and then future avenues for research. So before I introduce them, I just wanted to give you a heads up. So we will have about half an hour to 45 minutes of presentation time from our presenters. And I would invite you to either hold your fire, note down your questions on a notepad, or post them in the chat, and we will monitor them. And we will bring those questions into a really extensive amount of time for Q&A, for discussion. This is meant to be a conversation that will happen in the last half hour of the meeting. So we thought we give you first the full ins and outs of all of this for the first half an hour, 45 minutes, and then have an informed conversation based on what you heard. But as said, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat. So without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce Professor Kati Kräner, Dr. Julian Röckert, and Dr. Lukas Mogge, who are associated and affiliated with the RWI, Leibniz Institute for Economic Research here in Germany, and or the Ruhr University Bochum. So we're so glad to have you here, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Kati.
Great. Thanks a lot for the kind introduction, Clemens. Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here today. Let me briefly introduce our institute, RWI. So we are a center for economic research. So we are about 120 researchers with the headquarters in Essen and another office in Berlin. We are a non-profit organization and conduct economic research at the macro level, at the micro level, but all with a sight on policies. Now, Julian, Lukas, and me, we are part of a new unit at RWI, which is called the Economic Policy Lab, Climate Change, Development, Migration. So here our focus is to understand the impact of climate change on the lives of people in the Global South and how these affect migration movements and development. So that's our research agenda. We are a group of about 15 development economists and policies. So that's really our big focus. We do lots of impact evaluation studies, including on humanitarian assistance. So to give you a bit snapshot of the next 35 or so minutes, so we will start giving you a bit of an overview of why it's so important to conduct rigorous impact evaluation. Then secondly, we will move on and give you insights from our study in Mongolia, and we will close with an outlook of what it takes to conduct future evaluation studies. And with this, I hand over to my colleague Lukas.
Thank you very much, Kati, and thank you very much for all of us for being here and inviting us. So I start with the first part of the presentation on rigorous impact evaluation, why we need it and how to implement it. So continuing on what we've already heard, what Clement presented to us, there is still a need for research and evaluation also in anticipatory action. There are stakeholders in policy and science that have great expectation in the workings of anticipatory action. I think this is why we are all here, both the researchers and the stakeholders, because we're really hoping that anticipatory action is as promising as it seems to be. Though if we look at the evidence base in the papers that were also presented by Clemens, the open question still is there. Does anticipatory action really fulfill its goal to its full potential? So we think there's still need for methodological, rigorous impact evaluation, which can really give us the material at our hands to decide how and when and to what extent scale up existing anticipatory action programs. And especially we think for that, we need rigorous evidence with regard to how effective anticipatory action really is. Is it more effective for some groups than for others? So who's really benefiting from anticipatory action? Who should we target as stakeholders? How important is the timing of anticipatory action? So when should we give out the assistance? And how effective is anticipatory action in comparison to more traditional ex-post aid allocations? So I think there's a learning curve in anticipatory action, and Clemens used that nice word of bean counting. All started with that. The initial learning was really from anticipatory action projects that were implemented and the project reports by the implementing organization, which gave us insight into the workings of the project. So for us as researchers, that was really important to just read and learn how anticipatory action programs were implemented and also get the first feedback from the recipients. They were interviewed many times, their responses were written down in the anticipatory action reports by the implementing organization. So that gave us a first idea of what the people were thinking, the beneficiaries and recipients were thinking about the workings and the effectiveness of the program. Though, if you look only at the recipients, if you only interview them, and if you interview them maybe by the same enumeration people who have already implemented the study, there are concerns about desirability bias. And by that, I mean the tendency of survey respondents to answer questions in a way to please others, or in that case, to please the people who have implemented the anticipatory action program, and therefore really want the people to hear like, oh yes, this program worked very well for us. Thank you very much. So the key difficulty here is, it was hinted at, causal interpretation. That is what we want to achieve. We want to know whether a project really works. And for that, we require credible control groups that we compare the recipients to. There are some existing scientific evaluation studies out there. We have already heard about them and seen some examples. So some I wanted to highlight are by Gross et al., implemented in Bangladesh and in Mongolia. There is this highly cited and a very important study by Pope et al. From Oxford on a flooding event in Bangladesh. There are upcoming studies, as we have seen from the World Food Programme Office evaluation. And there's our study, which takes place in Mongolia and evaluates an extreme winter event in 2021. I think there's this problem in why we don't see more and more of this research, of this rigorous research, because there are challenges to do impact evaluation of anticipatory action. First, if we think about how we implement evaluations of anticipatory action, there's a great need for speed. So anticipatory action is kind of unknown beforehand when it's given out, and the anticipatory action and its evaluation activities must be ready to be implemented once the anticipatory action trigger kicks in. And that also means if we want to do an evaluation study and want to collect data, this data must be collected very, very quickly after an unknown point in time, and therefore ad hoc. Also, we know that collecting high-quality interview data for empirical studies, even outside anticipatory action in the humanitarian realm, is challenging. Enumerators that collect information from households must be experienced. We cannot just use anyone to collect this data. We need professional staff to do that. Those enumerators, as I said, should not be associated with the program. So we don't want people from the very same organization conducting the program and the interview, because that would lead to desirability bias. And we really want large samples of households to estimate the effects of the program precisely. And in the best case, even have such a large sample of such different households that we can conduct subgroup analysis and know more. And we want to have data from multiple points in time, which is really desirable, as you will see, for rigorous impact evaluation study, because it gives you both baseline and endline data. The design of evaluation studies is always complex, and this is also true for impact evaluation in anticipatory action. So first, what you need to think about is a counterfactual. So what should be the alternative scenario that the receiving of anticipatory action should be compared to? Should we compare recipients to households or individuals that have not received any assistance at all? Or should we compare those people that have received anticipatory action to those that received later or more traditional ex-post disaster aid? Then we have to think about the control group. So how to avoid that dissimilar groups of households are compared. We have learned already that we need to compare similar households to each other to understand well why those recipients are actually benefiting from the project and how they're benefiting from the project. So to learn how recipients benefit from a program, we must compare them to non-recipients with similar characteristics. And especially that happens often in humanitarian aid. If recipients are selected based on vulnerability criteria, and there are many good reasons to do that, it is difficult to disentangle the intervention effect from households' characteristics. There are, luckily, some different strategies to construct a valid control group. We will focus on the randomized controlled trials, which are considered the gold standard in impact evaluation. They really tend to measure the difference in well-being between randomly selected participants and randomly selected non-participants of a program. So think about it in that way. So you have a study population, everyone is in there, and then you randomly select them into two groups. One group that will receive the treatment, the anticipatory action, and one that will not receive the treatment. You have data from the beginning, from the study population, and you will conduct data later on both groups. You do follow-ups for the treatment group and the control group, and then compare the results. And this allows you to interpret the difference between the groups as the causal effect of the program, because except for their random allocation into the treatment and control group, those populations, those study populations in treatment and control are on average very, very similar. And this approach, which comes usually originally from medicine, has won 3 economists the Nobel Prize in 2019, Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kremer. So how could we implement RCTs in anticipatory action? You might already have an idea. So a randomization might not be easy for several reasons. We propose one idea that we will give an example to, where we leverage existing household surveys, and we claim that this offers a cost-efficient solution for impact evaluation, for rigorous impact evaluation. Because if you use pre-existing data collections, there is no desirability bias because the data collection is independent of your intervention. Also, you will see that baseline data already exists in an existing data collection that you can use to allow for a comparison of household welfare over time, on the one hand side, but also allows for a comparison of subgroups based on pre-disaster and pre-anticipatory action characteristics. If you have multiple survey waves, you can also consider looking at long-term effects, such as resilience and sustainability outcomes. And the best thing about it is the data collection costs are already covered. So the pure cost of implementing a household survey from a representative sample, which is what you want to do, of rural households in the global south, baseline and endline, from our own experiences, and we have implemented some of those surveys, is at least around 180,000 USD. So that is quite a bit of money that you can save if you decide that you go already for an already existing data collection. And that is what we did in Mongolia. And that is the example that Julian will present to you right now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lucas. So it gets a bit more concrete now after the methods part. So I'm taking over and want to present to you this rigorous impact evaluation we did in Mongolia. So a little bit on the context here, the hazard in Mongolia. So first of all, in Mongolia, in rural parts of the country, pastoralism continues to be the main economic activity. So herding households that live as nomadic people have animals, mostly like the 5 species here on the picture: sheep, goats, cattle, camel, and horses. And these animals provide them with milk and meat, but also they can sell animals and their byproduct to generate some cash. And also animals are collateral for loans. So basically animals are most of what they have, and they serve a lot of purposes in their livelihoods. So coming to the hazards, these are winter disasters called Zut in the local language, and these winter disasters endanger this traditional production system of herding livestock. These are actually climatic events that are caused by an interplay and combination of adverse weather conditions, as we call them. So this may be extreme temperatures and storms, but also a lot of snowfall. And they all result in sudden livestock death due to animals freezing or starving to death. And the livestock losses actually peak in late winter or early spring, so in the April to June, March, April, June period, when herders run out of fodder reserves and cannot feed their animals anymore, and they are very vulnerable to these winter conditions. So in the past few decades, there have been 5 very major winter disasters in Mongolia. And here on the right-hand side, there is a graph that shows you the aggregated livestock mortality in percent over the last decades. So the dark shaded bars here are really extreme winters where livestock losses reached a very high level. And exemplary in 2010, you see that the aggregate livestock losses were around 25%. So 25% of all animals in the country died within one winter. And there's also some variation in space. So in this very winter of 2009, that was super extreme, some 40% of all the households lost more than half of their herds. So it's really tremendous impacts on the livelihoods of these herding households. And also there were several regional disasters that led to humanitarian appeals. So there were some DREF appeals in 2010, the said extreme winter, but also in other years, as you can see there. And also emergency appeals have been raised repeatedly in the last decades. So coming to the anticipatory action a little bit, like the early warning, early action that is existing in Mongolia. So the early warning component here is a risk warning system that has been developed after this very extreme winter in 2009-10 that I just spoke about. And this encompasses the publishing of so-called ZOOT risk maps, here depicted on the right for 2 different years, that are published by the National Emergency Unit of Mongolia. And they are actually published in December or already in November, and then updated in January and February. So to update basically the risk projections on the experience, how the winter develops over time. And then there's also the early action component, and Mongolia really is a pioneer here. And the Red Cross is also, because it triggered the first anticipatory action in the country already in 2017-18, so quite long ago. And there's also other organizations that do use these maps to trigger anticipatory action. And these include, besides of the Mongolian Red Cross, the FAO, but also Save the Children and World Vision. So coming to our project that Lucas was already referring to, our randomized impact evaluation of anticipatory action in Mongolia. So this project is called Cash Eval, and we actually applied and received funding from the German Federal Office for this project, and teamed up with the NGO People in Need in Mongolia. And also there were the National Statistics Office of Mongolia was involved in the project because they were collecting the baseline and endline data for us. And the scientific part, so writing up the study and also the study design was undertaken by us. Formerly, we were at an institute called PIK, and now we are all located at RWI. So coming to the aim of the project, as you might have guessed, it's about assessing the effectiveness of early action cash transfers to Mongolian households, to Mongolian herding households that are at risk of facing these extreme winter conditions that we just learned about. So for this study, we really used a unique window of opportunity for this rigorous impact evaluation, and we implemented, as we think, for relatively low cost. Why is that? Because we did build on an ongoing and fully funded household survey, as Lucas already talked about in the methods part. Then we build on established partnerships between us, the researchers, but also practitioners at the NGO and the statistics office. And we were able to react spontaneously to the warnings for this extreme winter event. So a little bit more on the figures, on the numbers, nuts and bolts of this project. So the overall funding volume was around $200,000. We distributed, or People in Need, the NGO, distributed around $90,000 in assistance, and the rest of the money was for research and administrative costs. The study population is 925 households, and we targeted 421 of these households and reached 381. And really the participation criteria here on the right-hand top box. So for households to be eligible for the program to receive cash transfers, they had to participate in the pre-existing household survey that we conducted in Mongolia, and also live in a district with medium to very high risk, as projected by the risk maps, and be livestock owners. So basically, livestock owners are at risk. So this is also an eligibility criteria. Where was this implemented? In 3 western provinces of Mongolia, namely being Uf, Safgan, and Gobi Altai. And the modality of the transfer, we did this, or the people in need, the NGO did this with bank transfers, as a bank account ownership is close to universal, and all our participants had no problems with assessing their bank accounts. And the value of this transfer was around 236 US dollars on average. And we did this in March 2021. The cash transfers were distributed in March. So coming to the data part. So I said before, there is this pre-existing household panel survey. This is called Coping with Shocks in Mongolia Household Panel Survey. And this is basically a survey that is conducted with livestock owners in Mongolia, in the 3 western provinces of Mongolia named before. And the key feature is that these households are interviewed over time. So they are interviewed many times over the years. And the sample is constituted by around 1,800 households, and among them are 1,100 pastoralists, so herding households. This is equivalent to 7,000 individuals, and the data is collected in 49 districts. So it's quite an effort and quite an extensive data collection here. It's also representative for urban and rural areas, which is important for scientific studies. And as said before, it's collected since 2012. So each household has been interviewed 5 times by then. So what's the survey? So what's the interviews about actually? It's really extensive, so herding households and the rural population gets asked a lot of questions in each wave, so every year, again and again. So obviously there is like the classics like household demographics, so the age and the gender of household members, but also personal characteristics of the head of households, and importantly also for our study on the effectiveness of anticipatory action, welfare outcomes. So primarily we look at livestock assets because the animals are so important for the livelihood, but also at income and consumption of household members and the household as such. Then we have obviously some climate-related questions, so about the past extreme winters, and about adaptation strategies, what households do to avoid losses in livestock during winter. And here on the right-hand side, you can see some interview situations. On the lower pictures, also Lucas and me, we were fortunate enough to travel to Mongolia and then attend some interviews. So coming again to the study. So Lucas already talked a little bit about RCTs and impact evaluation. So one very important thing is to have data before and after the distribution or the implementation of an anticipatory action program. And this is actually what we have with this survey. So here on the graph, you can see that the wave 4 interviews in 2020 were undertaken before the extreme winter and also before the cash transfers happened. And the endline data, so the data that was collected in wave 5 is after the transfer of the cash. So now coming to how are we actually evaluating this? So as I said before, step 0, this was existing before we even started to implement the anticipatory action, was collection of the baseline data. Then step 1, there was this warning of the extreme winter, the risk map coming in December 2020. And we use the January map that is depicted here on the right-hand side for assessing the risk of households. And in red, in black shaded here is the survey area in the western part of the country, where actually the survey participants are living. So in the second step, we used a lottery to randomly select recipient households. This is the RTT approach. And then we have a treatment group that receives cash transfers of around $200 and a control group. Then step 3, the transfers were undertaken on the bank accounts of recipient households. And step 4, we collect the end-line data on the well-being of all households. As there's still in step 5, so we do compare the well-being of recipients and non-recipient households after the intervention took place to see if there's any difference between the two groups. So clearly there is an ethical question involved in this randomization. So is it really justified to split the households we survey in recipient and a control group? So our approach here is to present some arguments, but obviously this is a very open question and also up for discussion. So from our point of view, this randomization approach allows insights into the effectiveness of cash transfers, and these rigorous studies really help to spend scarce humanitarian resources effectively, but also engage the donor community and convince the donor community. So we think there is really long-term benefits for everyone from these studies. So then also in the control group, we would argue that the households are not disadvantaged compared to a scenario where no project has been undertaken at all. And we do randomize on the level of sub-district. So it's not on the level of households, but it's really that either all survey households in a given sub-district receive a cash transfers or not. And then also regional specificity of Mongolia is that the population density is extremely low, and there is likely not as much potential for conflict as in other contexts. And our approach overall is to have a transparent communication on the purpose and the potential benefits of this evaluation with partners, donors, but also local contexts and local community leads. So coming to the results of our study, actually, when we consider the full sample of all households, notwithstanding if they are rich or poor, we do not find any significant and detectable effects of the cash transfers. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind that we did not target households based on wealth eligibility criteria here. And there is, however, and this is a very positive finding, robust evidence that poorer households in our sample are benefiting from the cash transfers. And here on the right-hand side, there's a table. I won't go into that, but just for you to illustrate how this would look in a study, in an econometric study that we would publish. There's always a lot of tables and a lot of numbers and a lot of arguments about statistics. But basically, the important part here is that there are some stars which indicates that there is statistically significant effects. And namely, these are that our cash transfers that we distributed increased the post-disaster herd size. So really, recipients do have more animals as compared to non-recipients. Also, there's more investments in the herd. And increases in the consumption of livestock. Yeah, here on the right hand, on the top side, there's also just a little information like the eligibility criteria that are applied by Red Cross Mongolia in their anticipatory cash programs, and these are relating to the household composition, but also to how many children households do have. So a second slide on results. So we did a back of the envelope calculation on a return of investments of this intervention, and we do this on the basis or like on the experience of the poorer pastoralists that really benefited from the intervention. And we consider the amount of cash transferred to households, and then we see how much are they differing from non-recipients, how much were they able to increase their herd size, and so on. And we find that there is a cost-benefit ratio of around $5, meaning that for every US dollar that was invested in cash transfers, in anticipatory action, poorer households were able to increase the value of their herds by 5.2 times, so to 5.2 US dollar. And there is actually always, when you do these kind of studies, you learn a lot and you learn how to make it better the next time. So there is basically a lot of lessons that we learned, and please feel free to reach out to us and ask for these. We also state them in the paper, but very in the last chapter. So the most important ones for us is that the study design really needs to account for uncertainty in predicted and realized risk. So if the risk projections are not really materializing, how do we deal with this in these studies? And also, it's desirable to have large sample sizes for these studies that allow for simultaneously testing heterogeneities by wealth, so looking at different levels of wealth of the recipients, but also different levels of risk that households were exposed to. Right, and with this, we want to sketch out some further avenues for future research or also evaluation studies, and I hand over to Lucas once again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and of course, the avenues for future evaluation studies build on the learnings that we have from conducting our own first study in that regard. And what I'm going to present right now, the ideas, what we think are the important questions that should be tackled in further research, very much come from our perspective as researchers, with our own lenses that we wear as researchers. So if there are implementers and stakeholders here in the room that have other ideas, I think that is a conversation that we're very willing to have, and we're very interested to hear whether that matches what you think. So when we think as researchers about the need for future research, the first thing that comes to our mind is really we need to increase the evidence base of anticipatory action programs, because anticipatory action nowadays is implemented in so many different countries all around the world. But if we remember the table from the first-hand side, first slides, where do we have actually the evidence? From which countries, where do we conduct the studies? We see that this is Bangladesh, this is Nepal, this is Mongolia again. And so I think we would really argue to conduct more studies to learn from more different places, and also compare learnings from different scenarios. So in different places, we will find different hazards. We have slow onset disasters, we have sudden onset disasters. We do have regions where we find multiple hazards at the same time. And I think in all of those different contexts, it is important to think again, what is the evidence here? How should anticipatory action work? How can it work? How does it work? The next one is to think hard about the modalities, about the deliverance of anticipatory action and the perfect value, the optimal amount that we are going to give out to recipients. So what is the best type of assistance in a given context? And again, I think that might differ from context to context. What is the best delivery channel? what is the optimal value if we decide that we want to give out cash assistance. If we think that this is the optimal modality, then the question is still, what is the optimal value? And do we want to give it out once, or do we want to give it out multiple times? What are the benefits and disadvantages of the one or the other approach? I think what is still outstanding is a really solid comparison of the effectiveness of anticipatory action to ex post more traditional kind of aid. So for that, we need to quantify the efficiency losses that we have due to mistargeting. So in Mongolia, we accounted the situation that we have the predicted risk of an extreme weather event, which is highlighted here on the left-hand panel of this graph. But this did not fully match with what we then saw as a realized risk, here depicted in terms of livestock mortality in 2021. So some regions were predicted to be at very high risk, but then did not experience this very high livestock mortality. So there is some kind of mistargeting, and this leads to an efficiency loss that we should quantify if we want to compare anticipatory action to ex post aids. And of course, on the other hand, we need to quantify the efficiency gains that we can win due to early action, where we have more preparedness and not so much reaction to a disaster. If we think that anticipatory action has so much benefits over ex post aid, we also need to think about the optimal timing of support. So how much lead time do we want to have to allow households to use assistance in the most useful way, always thinking about that more lead times means more uncertainty about the disaster. And we think that this is not only relevant for slow onset disasters, but also for sudden onset disasters. There's a new study that was already hinted at by the World Food Programme Office for Evaluation on anticipatory action during floods in Nepal. And I think they're trying to tackle exactly this question. We already hinted at that we would like to do some more subgroup analysis to understand which groups of recipients benefit the most from anticipatory actions. We tried to do that in our study in Mongolia, and there's some learnings from that already, that it seems that the poorest households profit most from the anticipatory action intervention that was implemented in Mongolia. Another heterogeneity that we looked at, so another subgroup analysis, we compared the households exposed to harsher and less harsh winter conditions, and we see no difference between the different households here in terms of the efficiency of the program. So for that, we think more research is needed, and we need more research with larger sample sizes to do more exact subgroup analysis and broaden our standing here on that point. We also want to think about the longer term effect of anticipatory action. I think that is not much studied at the moment. So I think it would really be beneficial for us to understand to what extent recipient households are better off in the long run, because that has huge implications from our return on investments that we're going to present and calculate. And then we want, of course, to know whether the anticipatory action really helps households not only to be protected against the one shock that they're facing right now, but whether it allows them to build resilience and be better prepared for the next extreme weather event. And for that, we need longer data collections. I think, lastly, what we find very important, because we're not only doing evaluations of humanitarian aid, but are also really interested in the development aspects, is to think all those elements together and think about the secondary effects that anticipatory action has on the local economies and on climate adaptation. So how does giving out anticipatory action influence the local markets and local prices, especially in those times of needs? And how does anticipatory action influence private investments in climate adaptation? Because we're giving it out in a context where we have the climate risks, where people also need to adapt to. So there's a new study after the study that we've already shown you, which we expect to publish as a working paper in autumn 2024, where we look at the effect of anticipatory action cash transfers on the demand for weather insurance in Mongolia. And some of the first results here are that anticipatory action recipients are actually more likely to purchase weather insurance. So stay tuned for the working paper that is coming out. and reach out to us. So impact evaluations in development and humanitarian aid are really at the core of our research agenda. So please get in touch with us if you want to have advice on methods for rigorous impact evaluation, if you want to partner up to implement a rigorous impact evaluation, or if we can help you out with country expertise on Mongolia, Ghana, and Vietnam in the context of development and humanitarian aid. So thank you very much. I think we're a bit ahead of time, but now we can open the floor maybe for Q&A. Clemens, over to you.
Thanks, Lucas, Julian, and Kati for the really comprehensive presentation. That's fantastic. And now it's time for questions. Actually, before we jump to the question bit, I just wanted to highlight again briefly the opportunity that if what you've heard today sparks your interest, and as we said at the beginning, you have a sustained interest and engagement in anticipatory action evidence generation and use, consider joining our practitioner group. So if you are interested, just get in touch with the co-chairs. That's myself, Clemens, or Nicholas from FAO. You find our email addresses here and just tell us a bit about what you're doing, and then we can set you up with the group. So without further ado, let's hear from the floor. And I've already seen one interesting question here from Carolyn. Maybe do you want to just come off mute and share that question yourself rather than me reading it out? Carolyn.
Of course. Thank you first very much. Really interesting presentation and lots of great ideas. I'm always loving the fact that people are doing RCTs, but also bemoaning the fact that we have to do them to prove that we have to give money to people. And so the question for me is really around, basic things that the RCTs have already proven that you can just take as granted and in designing programs going forward without having to continuing to do RCTs about those things. And I gave the example of poor households obviously benefit more. Also, whether there's an event that happens or not, if you target poor households, obviously they still benefit, don't they? So they might not benefit in the sense of anticipatory action, but they'll benefit anyway. So there's just some of these kind of core principles or core assumptions that you, as having done these, would just say again and again are the things that you wouldn't need to prove anymore, if you like.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Perhaps we take one or two more questions before we hand it back to the speakers. Thank you, Caroline, for sharing that question. I've heard it also in many different fora before, kind of framed as, at what point are we satisfied with the evidence we have, at least for certain pockets or segments of the intervention or of anticipatory action? Anita, did you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I just want to vigorously support what Carolyn said, because for medical trials, at some point, in each context, different segments of the population will have different experiences with a medical drug, but at some point, when you can see something works, it works, and then you don't need to keep on collecting data to prove it works. So I mean, I think I really agree with you that you would need to look for different impact that you're trying to address and different hazards. I completely agree with that. And I disagree with, if we have limited budgets, which we do, I disagree with looking at a broader, population and looking at higher wealth groups. Sorry, no, we don't have enough money. $180,000 US is way beyond the budget, even of combined agencies in a country that decided to do a joint scoping, for us anyway, I would say. So I would disagree with looking at the wealth groups, because to me that's quite obvious. If you give them a small cash transfer or you do a small intervention, that you won't see a significant sort of impact. And I would say what would be super, super useful, is to look by impact, look by hazard, and because also you can't quantify, for example, lead times, like how many days. You can't do that. It's different in every context. But what you could say is, we need to do X, Y, Z actions, whatever that number of days is, in order to prevent or mitigate impact. So let's take livestock. You just need enough days to be able to you know, get hay, get shelter, get medication, you know, whatever it is. And if you don't have enough time, you know, if they don't have enough days to do that, you know, because their distances to market and so on are different in different places, then this would not be an effective anticipatory action. So rather than quantifying the days, you tell the actions that they need to be done.
Maybe should we pause it there, Anita,
yeah.
or conclude that thought?
Yeah, so that's the kind of concluding thought. That would be super useful to have that according to the impact. So then at least we can lay that sort of piece of research to one side and say, like, we know for livestock, you know, where we're trying to address the impact of livestock with this particular hazard, this is what's needed and this is what's effective. Yeah.
Right. Then maybe let's take these questions as they're broadly on sort of evidence, how much evidence is enough, and sort of the sub questions one might ask. And then I already see two very interesting follow-up questions in the chat. So back to you. Maybe Kati, you distribute or respond accordingly amongst your group.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. Let me start, and then Lucas and Julian, you just add. Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think I would slightly disagree. I think at this stage, we have not assembled enough evidence to make the claim anticipatory action works. Yeah, so we have seen on our slides 5 existing studies, but if you then consider the number of countries, the number of hazards where anticipatory action is giving out, so I think this is too little to really, you know, be confident that it works so efficiently. So from my research perspective, I think we need more to come to a stage where we have, you know, a similar feeling on other development interventions, yeah, where there is enough evidence that, you know, economists would say, yes, it works. Yeah, so we need to get there. And in my perspective, we are not there ready. But the second question is also, like, we are facing times of scarce funding, including for humanitarian assistance. So I think if we, you know, consider how to allocate funding in the future, I think we should really make decisions on where to spend, how to spend, whom to target based on evidence. Yeah, in order not to waste any scarce potential public funding. So that is my view. Lucas, Julian, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks very much. So I think it really depends, like that there's no black and white, but like lots of shades of gray. And what I think, like, okay, certain things, certain knowledge we have generated, and maybe we do not need to focus on that again when we try to regenerate knowledge again. So the next study that I would design myself, if I had the funds available to design a study, I would not try to target a representative household sample in Mongolia, but I would go for going for poorer households and see, okay, those are, there we see large effect, there it works, but still there are open questions. So in the study, for example, we found, as I said, that a harsher winter does not seem to make the program more efficient. So that is somewhat puzzling also from an anticipatory action perspective. And that is something that needs more evidence and where we need to look in more detail into. So I think all the research that we have opens new question that we then need to tackle in new research, which is also, I'm saying that because I'm a researcher, so I'm always interested and fascinated by those questions and want to answer them. But I do think they're valid. I do think they're valid points and they should be addressed.
Yeah, maybe a very, very brief one on this. So I think I like a little bit taking up on Lucas' point. So I think, for example, for deciding when to target, this would be a question that I haven't seen any research on this. So comparing really like anticipatory action to more traditional ex post aid, this is really a key question. What is really the benefit of being early, and when should we target in different contexts? And I think the best way to generate this evidence from our view and the view of many in research is to conduct these trials or do at least like rigorous studies. There's a lot of other avenues also aside from RCTs, but I think we really need a lot of more evidence to really make the best out of these programs and to design them wisely.
Thank you. I see an interesting question from maybe Beatrice. You want to come off mute if you're still around and raise that question?
Hi. Yes. Yeah, I was just building on what Anita had said about when you're trying to determine what the lead time, like the appropriate lead time is based on like specific actions. It was kind of a question just around like how much of the metrics and indicators used in the study were built on the needs of the communities, and also how much of the learnings were fed back into. Because one of the lessons learned was, or one of the questions for future evaluations was based on building resilience. And I think that's also one of the important things, is building understanding within the communities and within like capacity strengthening, basically. I think I was more eloquent in my written question, but yeah.
Certainly more succinct, but not more eloquent, I would say. And by the way, on that point of feeding things, or the relationship that we as researchers have with communities, there is a fantastic piece of guidance and reflection on accountability and disaster risk financing, which you will find via our working group or on the website of the Center for Disaster Protection, which reflects on exactly that in a little more depth. Before I see already Lucas has his hand raised, I would build one sort of question onto that, which is, how early do you think you were? Given like that question of, okay, what's early enough? What difference does it make to be early versus late? And I think the time when you gave cash, some might consider early, some not so early. So I'd be curious for your reflections on that. And before I turn it back, Jose was mentioning something about the bigger impact that we saw, I think, for poorer households rather than richer, and the implications of that. Maybe, Jose, do you want to say something on that before we turn it back to our speakers?
Hello, Clemens. Am I
Yes.
the only Jose here? It's a common name. No, thank you, Julian, Kathy, Lucas. Yeah, I was listening and going through the study when the link was there, and it was, yeah, as you were saying in the study, you mentioned there's really no significant impact. Yeah, okay. So again, as a practitioner, I find that worth exploring further, like you said, and it's coming out now. Maybe if we compare before and after, maybe if we compare it with weather insurance, I don't see it as a negative. I see it as an avenue, because I think it's a wake-up call. A research of this magnitude saying there's no significant impact is something that we practitioners should take seriously. I just wanted to make that comment. Now, with that with that question, I was looking forward to all those things that you had already mentioned. I think studies that whenever we pool fund, Anita was saying, and you already mentioned it. Do you see this in the horizon? Because I think that informs practice, comparing the questions and the comments you've already made, the before and after. Maybe there's no significant difference in itself, but there's a significant difference in the before and after. Maybe there's no significant impact only within but significant within the lower wealth groups, but across modalities, whether insurance, as you mentioned, versus AA. I was also wondering if that is something that you'd like to comment on, and if that is in the works. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, I think it's very important to emphasize that no impact applies to the richer groups, and the poorer that are conventionally targeted by anticipatory action assistance, given scarce resources, etc. There is an effect there, luckily. Over to you guys first before more questions.
Okay, should I start? Okay. Yeah. A follow up on the question that you asked, Clemens, also Anita and Beatrice, about the timing of our anticipatory action cash transfers that we did in March 2021. So you know it, others may not. In the Mongolian context, the winter goes, or the harshest winter month where most livestock dies, so probably April. So we were still before that, but still other implementation agencies conduct their anticipatory assistance dispersal earlier in January, February. And I think that is exactly what I think of an extremely interesting research question, like what would be the difference of giving out aid earlier? For budget constraints and time constraints, that was the only thing that we could do in this one study. But I think that is a very, very important avenue for future research to understand, okay, if we now do the whole thing 2 months earlier, would we see very different effects to what we have seen right now? Keeping in mind that 2 months earlier, we were less sure about how risky this winter is going to be, because the risk projections are meteorological projections, and they are worse the further you go back in time. So, or the longer you want to predict into the future, if you want to reverse it. So that is what I meant by checking difference in lead time, just to follow up on that one.
Okay, let me just address your interesting point, Jose, on, is it no significant impacts? What subgroups do we highlight our results on? And actually, we started with asking ourselves, actually, who are the people for whom anticipatory aid is most effective? Yeah, who decides a threshold? Yeah, is it like 150 animals that a household needs to have, or less than that to be eligible? Or is it 200? And to us, it seemed like this is really random. Yeah, so we really wanted to test in our study, what threshold actually makes sense. So, how many livestock does a household need to have in order not to need such assistance when, facing extreme conditions? So it was an open question that we started with. And in the end, we did find it really helps anybody with less than 300 animals. So if we consider this threshold, families with and without 300 animals, it's much higher compared to other programs. Yeah, so Clemens, you could kick in here. I think the program you evaluated from the Mongolian Red Cross used a threshold of 150 animals. Yeah, so it targeted only the very poor. So it's also an open question. Yeah, so I think it makes sense to really be open whom to target. Another question I really liked is, how to get results back to the community, but perhaps even more importantly, how to design a policy so that it meets the requirements, that meets best the needs of a community. And here it was really helpful to have a clear division of roles. Yeah, so we as researchers, we just carried out the evaluation. It was our partner, People in Need, so NGO with long time experience on the ground in Mongolia, who had like a best feeling on, how to best help households. Yeah, so they had the experience and said, cash is best, because then people can decide, if it's better to purchase food for children in the household, if it's better to purchase hay for the animals or medicine for the animals. Yeah, so it's really good to partner up with researchers doing, specifically impact evaluation, teaming up with implementing organizations, teaming up with partners, having a clear division of roles. But it was helpful that the NGO People in Need was with us, because they also communicated results back to herding communities in Mongolia. So they have local staff, they did lots of media interviews, played small videos. Yeah, so again, that illustrates how helpful it was to have different roles played by different people in this project.
Almost everything said, but not by everyone. Julian, you want to complement anything to what Lukas and Kati said?
No, we can have another question. I will be happy to answer that.
Fantastic. There I see Anita is of course ready with another question. I just wanted to drop the link in the chat on the accountability piece, which I find wonderfully written and structured in terms of the different dimensions of accountability of disaster risk financing, of which anticipatory action is perhaps a sub aspect to affected populations. Anita, rather you say it than I read it. Keep it short.
that's difficult. Yeah, no, I was just wondering if we could get some insights, or maybe if you've started brainstorming already on the kind of impacts or hazards that you might, you think would be the next sort of priority, like would they be the most commonly hazards, most common hazards that we work on with an anticipatory action frameworks, or impacts, if there's any particular ones, because it's obvious, that if you protect livestock, you will probably see a greater impact than if you protect, I don't know, household assets, and some are difficult to quantify, right? So, that also leads me on, the humanitarian imperative that we feel very strongly about, like, how do you put a price on protecting lives? Some people won't evacuate, for example, if you don't, provide that boat service, or, you evacuate the livestock with them. So, yeah, lots of questions in there, but just I would like to know if you have already some sort of ideas of your next research. Over.
And I want to put two more pieces into the suggestion box that Anita has just opened. One is about sort of cash and its alternative modalities. So is cash always the most efficient? Or if we see that 95% of people buy livestock fodder, for example, wouldn't it be, transaction costs, etc., considered be an alternative to distribute in kind? First piece. And the second piece is, since you did a back of the envelope calculation on the benefit to cost ratio, if you would consider or have ideas on, I guess, suggesting a standardized methodology by which one could look at this question of benefit to cost ratio in anticipatory action, or sort of a return on investment calculation, which are floating around in multitudes out there, but many being like just heavily assumption based and written without so much grounding in evidence. So, and especially when thinking of interventions that are less sort of livestock targeted. So in your case, it was easier perhaps to prize the goat and the cow and the sheep and so on. So if you think of other contexts, how could one do this? And now, super happy to see that you're working in other contexts that are maybe not as livestock economy driven. What could be those ways? So I'm not expecting you to have an answer, but these would be things that we would be excited for you to bring back to help other researchers do better. Other questions? Think about it. We'll turn it back to the speakers, and then we do perhaps a last round of questions if there are still some left.
Okay, let me take the liberty to start, and then Julian and Lucas kick in. Oh, Anita, I think it's a great question. And I think clearly there is a limit on what economists should evaluate. Yeah, so clearly we are not positioned to evaluate any effects on people's lives. That's not our business. And I think there's also a limit to what should be evaluated. Yeah, or for instance, there are circumstances, if we talk about refugee populations, whereas there's absolutely no need for, rigorous impact evaluations. You just need to help people, assist people. Yeah, so we are talking about doing rigorous impact evaluations in contexts that are not life-threatening, say, where it's about limiting the economic impacts. And also we are limited in what we can count in surveys. Yeah, so clearly we cannot put any number on a person's life, and that's something economists wouldn't like to do. But having said that, our survey also takes the height and the weight of all children below age 8. So in this study, we didn't consider the health of children, but in principle, this would be one avenue where also economists could indicate, this is the effect of, a policy intervention or the effect of a shock, put it negatively, on, the body conditions of children. And that again, can be projected. Yeah. So if children, are not being fed well enough during a crisis, it's very conservative to say or to calculate the long run effects on children's lives. Yeah. So that kind of assumption, would be possible to be made. Just briefly on your point, Clemens, so is cash really the best modality? I think that's a super relevant point. So even if we just consider the economy of Mongolia, yes, people did spend lots of the cash they received on livestock fodder, but I think it's a different thing if one does the anticipatory intervention in kind, yeah, because then one would introduce, some artificial effects in local markets. Yeah, and that's another dimension of anticipatory aid that one must carefully consider. So if one starts to hand out animal fodder in large quantities, this has an effect on the remaining people not receiving any transfer from an interaction. Yeah, so yeah, it's something that's not really well understood in my point of view, but something that needs to be put on the research agenda. And here I stop.
Yeah, maybe to add a little bit on the cash versus in kind. I mean, for me, for example, would also be fascinating or very, very important, as I think, to study when cash is given out and get really an idea how people spend it more accurately than we could do in our survey. So there's now also this trend in economics and also in a lot of impact evaluations to do high frequency data collection, meaning that people are called and give a very short interview over phone, which is also not so expensive, and then really learning how people spend their cash and how they react to warnings or also to information that is given out. I think this is something I would be very, very interested in.
And you being economists, please do consider our request and plea for use your next research grant to produce a wonderful piece of guidance on cost-benefit analysis and return on investment calculations for anticipatory action. We would love that for different contexts. It would really do many organizations a great service. A last round of questions? Now would be the opportunity to come in. You could just unmute yourself if you're interested. By the way, while you're thinking, if anyone else is interested in the costing, cost benefit, ROI realm, I think the best guidance that exists to date out there is from the International Rescue Committee, who have a resource page on cost analysis. They're being very transparent and very conservative in terms of what they do and how they do it. And cost effectiveness in terms of cost per outcome, for example, is as far as they dare to go. And I think they do it fairly well. So if anyone is interested in going in that direction, then you have something there. But I think more specific to AA and more sort of the economic side of it would be really interesting. Last opportunity to ask a question or raise a point. If not, closing words maybe from you guys, Kati, Lukas, Julian. Anything else you want to say or get off your chest?
I really enjoyed the discussion. So yeah, I think we benefit a lot. Yeah, hearing your points, hearing your needs. So definitely something we take on when we conduct our next impact evaluation. So thanks, and please reach out to us if you have more points to say.
Then I will, before I close, just also make two further pointers, which is at the Global Dialogue platform on anticipatory action, on which you will be able to find more information on the Anticipation Hub. That platform happens in the fall, and there the meal working group wants to share a bit or discuss two things that are a lot on people's minds when they think of evidence generation in anticipatory action. One is sort of a core menu of indicators, sort of as common metrics that we want to try to assess across contexts and interventions to come to a certain level of comparability, at least in terms of conversations and narratives as they unfold about anticipatory action. So thinking about different thematic areas like be they livelihoods, for example, or nutrition, or health or water sanitation, to have 2-3 indicators that your organization could choose from to say, okay, I want to include that question and therefore the questionnaire module into my evaluation to see kind of what effect did we have, if any. That's one point. The other point is inspired by conversations like these. We're looking at an evidence gap map, so to say, of what are the research questions that practitioners find the most interesting. What do we know? What don't we know? Where do we want further evidence? So again, IRC and Claire, who at least was on the call before, and she might be still here now, has done some fantastic work in this direction, and we want to build on that and take that forward. That is actually the second point. And then the third sort of bonus content is arriving at perhaps recommended minimum quality standards for anticipatory action impact assessment. So to not put stuff out there that is perhaps a bit dodgy. So we would love to feed our evidence database with stuff that is as robust as possible. So with that, thanks so much to Kati, Julian, and Lucas for joining us in today's conversation. Really appreciate you taking the time. You're sharing your experience and your insights. We look forward to having you back at some point, sharing more of the research that you are doing or will be doing in the future. Join us for the next community conversations. Some are already scheduled. You find them on the Anticipation Hub website. Check out the working groups. One on cash, for example, is currently in the process of being formed. So check in on the Anticipation Hub website regularly to just stay in the know. And we look forward to seeing you at the next conversation. So see you soon. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Bye now.